Hi, everybody. This is Lee, and I'm talking about Ralph Nader. I've got one of his older books, and I was reading through it, and I said what he wrote then is still applicable today. And it's this The Good Fight. And so I took a quick scan through it again. I pulled it off the shelf, and on page 26, and he's just going through a rundown of how the Republican and Democratic parties came to be like they are today. That prior to World War II, they were something else entirely. And I've noted that. I've tried to explain it myself with, well, specifically with the Republican Party, with Teddy Roosevelt, how the Republican Party was something different under his leadership, that it was very much people focused, definitely striking the correct balance between representing the interests of labor and then also corporations. There was a tendency for militarism, interventionism, with Teddy Roosevelt. He liked the good fight, but in terms of domestic issues, many things make more sense than they certainly do today. That the Republican Party of the turn of the 20th century wasn't bent on punishing ethnic minorities or even women or religious people of different religious backgrounds. That there was more tolerance, it was more progressive. And the fact that it was more progressive than it is today should disturb everyone. That we have regressed as a nation if we take a closer look. And Ralph Nader has. He's even gone through the Democratic Party. Teddy Roosevelt was the presidential representative of the Republican Party. And then after World War One, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who was the progressive representative of the Democratic Party. So two Roosevelts on either side of the aisle, progressive in nature. One was like a conservative, conservationist type of conservative, in the true sense of the word, Teddy Roosevelt. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the more New Deal Democrat type of progressive. And that at that time, Ralph Nader points out that after World War One, the Republican Party became tough on communism and then tough on street crime and somewhat militaristic. I mean, it had been under Teddy Roosevelt, and then after World War One, it became even more so. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was very frustrated that it took so long for the United States to enter into World War One. He's very frustrated about that. And then so we did, and I guess that made him a little bit happier before he. And so it seems like the Democratic Party was more conciliatory on issues, social issues, labor unions, worker rights, things like that. And so, and he's saying that after World War II, that the two parties kind of shifted a little bit. It was after World War II that the Democratic Party kind of diverged away from the Republican Party, and the Democrats paid more attention to minority and elderly rights, and then the Republicans kind of focused on international military issues. But there was some differences on civil rights, civil liberties, consumer, worker, environmental areas. But it seemed like the Democratic Party became slightly more progressive than Republicans after World War II, and that corporations, however, noticed that by 1960 and 1970s that they were being pummeled. Corporations were being pummeled in the 60s and 70s, sometimes, well, often, by Ralph Nader himself and the groups that he had worked with. with regulations, with oversight, things like this, holding corporations accountable in terms of consumer products, um, pollution, workplace safety, things like that. And so they fought back. And that this was in the 70s, and there was a a member of the U.S. House, Tony Coelho. He was the chief fundraiser for the Democratic Party, and that he agreed to follow a doctrine laid out by Lewis Powell, and that was to service the corporation. So, about the 1970s, there was a strategy born of shifting focus away from people oriented policies towards corporate friendly policies. And that the only way that was really accomplished was through cooperation by certain members of the Democratic Party to agree with the Republican Party to do that. And so by the 1980s, it had been set into place, that plan to service the corporations. Let's see. And so by Ronald Reagan's presidency, it became easier for the Democratic Party members, legislators, to put priority on corporate fundraising rather than serving the populist and progressive interests of the people. And that there was an exodus out of the Democratic House of legislators who did not want to participate in the Political Action Committee fundraising effort, that was not what they went to Washington for, that the game had changed by the 1980s at the instigation of Lewis Powell, who had joined the Supreme Court, and then Tony Coelho, the fundraiser for House members in the Democratic Party. And it answers a question that I had of specifically why Shirley Chisholm, say, and Barbara Jordan at that time decided to leave the U.S. House when they did in the early 80s. And, I don't know if that's specifically why, but it's a possibility. And, they likely weren't the only ones. According to Ralph Nader, several long-standing progressive members of the United States House chose to make their exit about the same time that there was this pivoting on corporate interests or towards corporate interests. And so, trade unions lost their influence. There was emergence of corporate and conservative Democrats, and that they out-hustled the progressive liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and that there was a march towards what was called the center. And we know now that the center is not really the center. It's actually the corporations, the oligarchy. There was actually a march towards the oligarchies within the Democratic Party. And then also, we can just say that it wasn't necessarily a march towards the right. It was actually a march towards the corporations. And that occurred under Ronald Reagan's, and there's a small lead up, and then it kind of showed itself in terms of actual things getting done during Ronald Reagan's presidency. And so that answers some questions. I'm going to go ahead and maybe post a little bit of something in the description. And you can see that what we're seeing today is not new, that there was a concerted effort to make it happen. And it continued under the direction of Bill and Hillary Clinton, this march towards not the center, this march towards not the right, but this march towards corporations, corporatism, Wall Street, the oligarchy, that was directed under certain political figures who wanted to enrich themselves and sacrificed populist policy to do that. And so there's a chance to regain it. I know that there is an effort to realign the United States House. And I'm making these videos just to make sure people understand why it's necessary to do this realignment. The fact that people keep saying, well, it's just too much, it's too big. And I feel like we got ourselves here, we can get ourselves back, maybe, or maybe not back, maybe even better than it used to be. But there is a need to make some changes. That what we're seeing today isn't new. It's been going on apparently since the late 70s, early 80s, where there's just been this reprioritizing of treating corporations like humans and then treating humans like animals. And so it's time to, I think, take back the government. Okay, good luck.